in studying Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the yoga of integral knowledge, Sri Aurobindo describes the conventional framework of the yoga of knowledge and develops from there the larger integrality of the yoga of integral knowledge. The key word distinguishing this approach from others is knowledge. But this word knowledge itself is a poor translation of the Sanskrit original jnana, jnana marga, path of jnana, the way of jnana. And in the Sanskrit, jnana has a more profound sense than the word knowledge in English. And so, even as Sri Aurobindo describes the higher and deeper dimensions of this path, he is redefining the meaning of this word knowledge and taking it to its deepest sense. What we have seen last time in our study was that intellectual deliberation and right discrimination are an important part of the yoga of knowledge. But their object is to remove a difficulty, and in themselves they don't lead to the final and positive result of this path. Knowledge or jnana is not merely intellectual deliberation and right discrimination. As the path of knowledge is popularly taught today, these two, intellectual deliberation and right discrimination, are given an exaggerated place. Study, reading, self-observation, self-analysis, these are primary means as they are popularly taught. The deeper traditions, though, use these merely as starting points. Sri Aurobindo observes that the right discrimination and intellectual deliberation will help to free ourselves from the ordinary intellectual notions of the goal to which we are growing. Because our presuppositions, prejudgments, old associations, sense errors, and desires cloud and block that towards which we seek to grow. And this intellectual deliberation, and the form it may be in reading, in satsang, in discussion also, in sharing, or right discrimination which may come from self-observation, self-analysis, these will all help to remove these immediate stumbling blocks. But then, after this initial purification takes place, he says it has to be followed by other operations, by vision, by experience, by realization. So while the first step of discrimination and intellectual deliberation remove limitations and create a space of greater purified understanding, the next three bring in positively the deeper experience towards which we seek to grow. Now he describes these three operations of vision, experience, and realization, defines them. And as is typical of Sri Aurobindo, even as he describes and defines them, he takes us through the stages and the steps through which we attain to their experience and realization. So the next paragraph that we are studying, Sri Aurobindo begins by asking, what are these? What are these operations? They are not mere psychological self-analysis and self-observation. Such analysis, such observation are like the process of right thought, of immense value and practically indispensable. They may even, if rightly pursued, lead to a right thought of considerable power and effectivity. Like intellectual discrimination, by the process of meditative thought, they will have an effect of purification. They will lead to self-knowledge of a certain kind and to the setting right of the disorders of the soul and the heart, and even of the disorders of the understanding. So, this is the role of self analysis and self observation. We find that in practically all of the New Age practices, there is to some degree an emphasis on self analysis, self observation as a means of self development. But the most important distinction we have to retain is that self development alone is not spirituality, is not yoga. Self development can help you to enhance and develop your existing powers and faculties. It may lead to extraordinary growth, even of the development of occult and paranormal powers, but none of these would bring it into the domain of spirituality. It is not spiritual unless that path of self cultivation aims at putting us in touch with the spirit and bringing the action of the spirit as the primary influence in our whole being. So, this first step of self analysis and self observation surely will help, and Sri Aurobindo says, if rightly pursued, can lead to right thought of considerable power and effectivity. And what is this right pursuing? In most cases, when people apply the power of self analysis and self observation, it is to improve, to overcome some limitation, to develop an efficiency in whatever direction we are going, and it may even be used to amplify and aggrandize the powers of the ego. I can become a more egoistically effective person by a certain application of self analysis, self observation turned to self development. So, the right application, the right use of this will, of course, be when we turn it in a direction which is supportive of the next spiritualization process. Otherwise, by themselves, they can even lead to the exaggerated human ego made more powerful and more effective. So, if rightly pursued, they can lead to right thought. And the right thought in this case would be even the recognition that the ego person that I am, to begin with, is intended to submit itself and lose itself, dissolve itself in the true person that I am, which is waiting behind and above. And if there is this kind of an orientation, then this process of self observation and self analysis can actually help to put us in touch with that higher consciousness and invoke it and its action in us more and more directly. And this would lead to a considerable power and effectivity even in our daily life and action. Like intellectual discrimination, by the process of meditative thought, they will have an effect of purification. So the process here of self-observation and self-analysis is a process of meditative thought. You observe yourself, you introspect, and the whole awareness and attention turns inwards as you do that. And this is a kind of a meditation, but a thought-based meditation, observation, and as you become aware of things within you, automatically you also acquire a certain hold, a certain control, a power to modify, to change. So this is a kind of a meditative thought, and it has the effect of purification. The mother spent considerable time in the classes that she took for the students in the playground to encourage this kind of self-cultivation. She took as the occasion the study of the Buddhist text of the Dhammapada, and most people did not see it as her advice to us for a practical self-cultivation. Rather, they just thought it's a thing to study and stop there. But there you will find in great detail Mother's observations of how this self-cultivation is to be done practically, and especially with the orientation required for the integral yoga. Now, the interesting part to Aurobindo's observation here is that not only there is an effect of purification, he says they will lead to self-knowledge of a certain kind. This is on the positive side, and on the other side, they will lead to setting right of the disorders of the soul and the heart, and even the disorders of the understanding. So on the positive side is this self-knowledge of a certain kind, and later he will say self-knowledge of any kind is a step towards the real self. So as we become more and more self-aware, as we get to know ourselves more deeply, these are always small steps in the direction of the realization of the higher self. But at the same time, there is a correction taking place in setting right disorders. He says the disorders of the soul, the heart, and the understanding. These are the three primary agents of our action in the world. You will notice that they are also, in a sense, the three broad lines of the yogas also. The disorders of the understanding would, of course, come in the way of the yoga of knowledge. The disorders of the heart would come in the way of the yoga of devotion, of love. And the disorders of the soul, in this case, meaning the sense of I person, the identity, the surface desire soul, would come in the way of the right will to action, which would be necessary for the yoga of works. But if we begin to observe ourselves, we notice very quickly that there are certain aberrations in our reactions, in our normal functionings, and until we begin to observe ourselves, we may not even notice those aberrations, or even if we notice them, the mind would quickly rush to justify and cover them up by some excuse. Or even if we realize that they are aberrations, we would find ourselves helpless to change them. I get angry every time that somebody criticizes my work, or my appearance, or my whatever it is, my weakness that at that moment. Why? I do not know. And because I do not know, I'm helpless, I'm unable. And then automatically I start avoiding exposure of that very thing which makes me angry, because I've become conscious that I get angry. I do not want to allow that situation to appear where I would lose my temper, and I begin to hold, to conceal, to cover up, with good intention perhaps, but that creates a second layer of distortion. And very often, a normal person will pass through life creating layers and layers of distortion in this way, until at some point they find themselves practically trapped by the layers they have themselves created and unable to break free. And generally, it is at that point that life helps, the divine grace helps through an intervention of a crisis, which suddenly shatters everything. And suddenly you're exposed, you're forced to face things as they are. And gradually one begins to rebuild now on a new platform, on a new level, with a new framework of our personality, character, and so on. But the moment we start self-observation, we notice these things, and then we begin gradually to untie these knots, remove these distorted layers. So of the soul, that is the desire soul, the I sense, the motive person on the surface, of the heart, my sentimentality, my emotions, the relationships that form from the heart, and then of the understanding itself. And in the understanding, I will even notice more complex things, that every time I rush to conclusion too soon, or I find that although I understand, I stop quickly when I think I have understood without allowing the deeper dimensions of the understanding to emerge. And things like that help us to get free of limitations of the power of understanding. And all of these are kinds of disorders which can be set right through self analysis and self observation. Then he says, self knowledge of all kind is on the straight path to the knowledge of the real self. So anything which helps for self knowledge is going to be good for this purpose. And he draws on the tradition of the Upanishad. The Upanishad tells us that the self-existent, capital S, self, the self-existent has so set the doors of the soul that they turn outwards. And most men look outward into the appearances of things. Only the rare soul that is ripe for a calm thought and steady wisdom turns its eye inward, sees the self, capital S, and attains to immortality. To this turning of the eye inward, psychological self-observation and analysis is a great and effective introduction. So at best, this can be an introduction. But there are many interesting suggestions here. First, he draws on the Upanishad to say this, that the self-existent, that is the divine self, as he moves into manifestation, has set the doors of the soul that they turn outwards. Now it's by intention, by design, that all the doors of the soul are turned outwards. And what are the doors of the soul? The gates through which the self within looks out at the manifest world. Now these are many gates in many layers. The most superficial of them are our five senses. These are the gates through which the person, the intelligence within, looks out and connects to the universe. If you shut down one by one all five senses, what would be left? You would simply lose contact. You would disconnect from the world as it is. You would not be in the physical world anymore. So it's the five senses at the last layer which are the plug, the link points into which our consciousness connects, through which to touch the world. Behind that are now the other faculties which process what comes through the five senses, including, of course, the power of thought, the powers of feeling, the powers of will, and so on. But all of these also are turned outwards. Now you notice, by design, all of our senses are listening out, are turned out. Do we ever bother to listen to the sounds inside our body? We don't. We're always listening with the awareness turned outwards. The same with the sight. We are looking out. At best, we may turn to look at our own body, but we do not turn the vision inward. Or the smell, taste, etc. You'll find all of these are turned outwards. It's as if the life energy as it formed the body had from the beginning turned all its awareness outwards, even while it is in the fetus. The being, the person in the as the fetus, is listening to the sounds around and responds to vibrations which it can catch. So it takes some effort at first to turn these inwards. When that begins to happen, sometimes people feel uncomfortable. I think I narrated here an unusual experience I had. It was in New York. A taxi driver was to take me to the airport, and he was listening to some music which was, I found, a little too racy, and I requested him to switch off the radio. He did that, and within about 30 seconds, he became extremely restless. And then he told me, I don't like this silence. I feel afraid. I don't know what to do. I need some noise. And so he waited for me to accept to have the radio. I was surprised. I just listened to him. Then after a while, he rolled down the window slightly so that the rushing air made this hissing sound. And then he said, now I'm comfortable. Now there's some noise. And it was interesting to observe how the silence made him uncomfortable. And you notice what happens when we're in silence. You go into a room, all the noise is cut off, all the sights are cut off, everything is dark. What happens? In the early explorations of the brain mind connection, the scientists used to wonder, because they saw mind as a product of the brain, what will happen if we isolate the brain from all the senses? Will the brain suddenly lose its provocations? What will happen, like a computer whose inputs are all cut off? Will it suddenly go into a loop of imbalance? Will we go crazy? Will we go mad? These were the kinds of speculations. So they tried very hard to create these chambers of isolation. It was difficult. Removing sound and sight is easiest, but sensation. How do you remove sensation at the very least of temperature, of warmth, of touch, of the skin? Even if you're sitting on a chair, there's a sensation. So they found a way to put a person in water, which was saline, so it just matched the density of the body with the exact same temperature, so that even the physical sensation on the skin was eliminated. And then they watched to see what will happen. Will the person go mad? And the most interesting thing that happens at that point is your mind starts wandering freely. Now it's disconnected from the physical senses and it begins to observe itself. It begins to observe its own inner dimensions. And they found many people, not all, but many people tended to have spontaneously what would be categorized as paranormal experiences. But mostly they would drift into some kind of an introversion and meditative states. Those who were used to meditation, of course, were very comfortable and very happy with the state. Others were disoriented for a while, but then drifted automatically into that kind of thing. So this inward turn is at first a bit of a discomfort, a surprise for those who are so stuck with the outward habit. But then once that begins, we find the exact same senses can be turned inwards and begin to observe things inside us. Even with the eyes closed, we begin to see, not with the sense of physical sight, but see our own thoughts, our own feelings and inner sensations. And of course, once the veil separating the physical consciousness from the inner is even slightly thinned or opened, then we begin to see and experience things with all five senses, things of the inner worlds. And then of course other faculties, other gateways of the soul, the doors of the soul also turn similarly inwards. The thought, the feeling, the action, all of these can go in. So only the rare soul that is ripe for a calm thought and steady vision turns its eye inward, and meaning here of course spontaneously. Now there are two conditions. The rare soul ripe for a calm thought and steady wisdom. And if you observe the things which make for the right kind of things which make for spontaneous meditation or spontaneous turn to spiritual life are precisely these two signs. There are those you will find who always are in a state of agitated thought. And then there are those who naturally tend to subside, to come into rest in their thinking. And then there are those who want specific knowledge and chase after it in life. And there are those who seek to understand more deeply, more profoundly, with a turn to wisdom and a deeper, more stable, lasting wisdom. And any of these two, ideally both of these two, would be the sign of somebody who is destined for this inward turn. And they don't need much. At best, they need a provocation externally, but generally they tend to find their own way in their inward introspection. But after that, the inward turn can go deeper and deeper, eventually sees the self and attains to immortality. This does not mean that everybody attains to self-realization. It means that they enter in relation with some power or aspect of the self and begin to experience through that contact the touch of the immortality of consciousness. The person so introspecting finds some base where he feels himself permanent, he feels himself free, he feels himself aware, awake in a way that nothing can change, nothing can disturb or cover, or he feels the foundation of wideness or peace. Whatever it is that he has touched, that becomes for him the reference point, the foundation on which he can then face all the difficulties of life. Often, one form in which this expresses itself is a kind of a fearlessness. The person has a practical courage that he does not fear taking a challenge, making an experiment, going that extra edge into a realm of danger, because deep inside somewhere he feels he is protected, that he's immortal, that he's free, or that he has the power to overcome whatever the situation might be, and so on. So it may not be a conscious realization of the self, but just that contact, that's enough to give you that touch of the immortality. To this turning of the eye inward, psychological self-observation and analysis is a great and effective introduction. So if we had to train someone, help somebody to train for the inner life, this would be the first step: self-observation, self-analysis. And you will remember the mother's advice to the students of the ashram school, that they maintain a practice of observing themselves every day, especially at the end of the day, to review the whole day's activities, observe their thoughts, their feelings, their motivations, their actions, their reactions, and put each of these events in a reference to their deeper aspiration, and then choose to put a will to modify, to put a will to change, or just in that reference choose what is important, what is less important, and begin to sift and organize their life around that central aspiration. So various variations of this exercise also, but all of them involve some kind of self-observation, self-analysis. If this much is begun, the rest of the journey is inevitable. And then he says, we can look into the inward of ourselves more easily than we can look into the inward of things external to us. So if this introspection is going to be our starting point, I can introspect myself or I can introspect others. But obviously, it's easier to introspect ourselves. But why? It seems so obvious, but still he explains why. And in that explanation, we find a few interesting insights. Because there, in things outside us, we are in the first place embarrassed by the form. And secondly, we have no natural previous experience of that in them, which is other than their physical substance. So these two insights are extremely valuable when in fact we have to observe something more profoundly which is external to us. What is it that makes us less effective in knowing others, in penetrating deeper into things than into ourselves? First he says, we are embarrassed by the form. This use of the word embarrassed is very interesting. It's not common in the colloquial usage of this word, but it is an accepted sense which is used in the English language. Prevented from, barred from. The word itself you'll find embarrassed, bar, the bar, which is something which is coming as a block. So we are blocked from by the appearance of the form. And secondly, he says, we have no natural previous experience of that in them, which is other than their physical substance. The form is with the physical substance. What is in them? Now, the previous experience of what is in them, we might find more easily with another human being. Oh, you are going through this difficulty. I know what it feels like. I have been through that. But consider what it would be like if you were to turn your attention to a dog or a cat or a cow and then try to feel what they might be feeling. And there is no reference. We don't know what it's like to be in the consciousness of a dog. Or if it is an extraterrestrial, what are their value system? What is their thought process? How would they feel? What are their values and priorities? How would they respond? It's not easy. We see a form and that's it. It's a cover which is blocking everything else. With human beings, we often go through this experience. Somebody is going through some intense difficulty, and yes, we give them the sympathy and support which we think we can, we should. But later in life, when we have gone through the same difficulty, we realize how shallow that support was, how shallow our own understanding of their difficulty was. And perhaps later, when we find somebody else in that difficulty, we are able to extend some more profound help. The key here is, unless we have experienced that thing in ourselves, we cannot recognize that thing in another. Now, this is the secret to deeper power of identification or even of intervention or help. The more we become aware of something in us, the more we are able to become aware of that in others. And this is the method by which we can know the universe and people and things and circumstances more and more deeply. And the method is to know ourselves more deeply first, and then the rest becomes almost, it's like everything opens up. It's the key through which everything else is now accessible. A purified or tranquilized mind may reflect, or a powerful concentration may discover God in the world, the self in nature, even before it is realized in ourselves. But this is rare and difficult. So it is possible that the journey of our spiritual exploration begins with things outside us and only later begins to discover those things within us. But it is rare and it is difficult. And what are the things which are possible though? And we need to observe each of the things which he is pointing to, because they're all lines of exploration of our spiritual journey. But what would be the benefit of those lines of exploration? After all, turning within is supposed to be the most effective, the most rapid. The turning outward has its benefits, which he points out in a footnote here. He says, in one respect, however, it is easier. The experience of the deeper dimensions outside us. In one respect, however, it is easier because in external things we are not so much hampered by the sense of the limited ego as in ourselves. One obstacle to the realization of God is therefore removed. So in this exploration outward into things outside us, the limitation of the ego is not there as a strong obstacle. When we begin to introspect in ourselves, all of our subjective experience is enormously reduced by the sense of the ego, distorted, and so on. But when we turn outside, we forget ourselves. We are now exploring something other than us. And somehow at that point, this narrowness of ourselves is not such a big issue. So let's take the examples he gives. A purified or tranquilized mind may reflect. So when the mind is made pure, that means it is no more rigid in its habits. It is no more bound to the heredity of its habits or the limitation of its narrowness. It is now made plastic, freely responsive, free, wide, open, purified, and then made tranquil. So having made the mind plastic, free, and then making it tranquil, it is like the surface of the water. The water, when it is violently agitated, or if it is dense, if it is rigid, it cannot move. And if it is violently agitated, well, there is no scope for anything subtle to reflect on it. But when it becomes still, even the tiniest ripple you will notice distorts the image that reflects in it. When it is made absolutely still, then it can reflect perfectly. What? Everything in the universe. Even the highest heavens, the stars, you will find perfectly reflected on the surface of the water. I had occasion some time back to see the astronomical observatory called the Jantar Mantar in Delhi. It is made in the model of an old tradition for observing positions of stars and planets minutely down to the second and even to split seconds. It is able not only to observe them but to synchronize the calendar to predict eclipses down to the second even today. How they did it is interesting. There were, of course, many things which involved physical alignments, but a lot of it was handled by putting wires across, perfectly aligned, and then lining up the crossing points of the wires with stars and observing reflections of the stars in a layer of water. So that reflection allowed many things to happen. It didn't need to use complex alignments of telescopes and things like that. You had certain patterns of wire grids, physical portholes, markers, and then in the water you could align those things in a certain way, and that's it. You got very high precision. The water, though, of course, had to be absolutely still. This is the kind of power that is existent in our minds. When we make our mind absolutely still, anything, however far away, at the other end of the universe can reflect in it. Of course, the symbol of the water stops, it doesn't go further, but when the mind is silent, it will reflect not only the physical realities, the subtler realities, but the realities of the present, the past, and the future. It can even go across time. Whatever you choose to know in the universe, in the past, present, or future, which may have happened, which might happen, which has actually happened, or not happened, or will not happen, or might happen, or is happening right now, or is attempting to happen, anything is available to this perfectly stilled, purified, tranquilized mind as a reflection. So there are actually two powers, two methods of gaining knowledge of things in the universe. One is this entering this state of purified, tranquilized mind in which we just turn our intention in any direction to know what we want. The other is to project a part of our consciousness into that which we wish to know and then know it from within. The second one involves some difficulty, some risk, some intervention, because when you project your mind, let's say I want to observe what's happening in another part of the world, and when I project my consciousness there, somebody seated there can sense my consciousness projected there and can push back, can interfere, and so on. But when I am seated here and put my mind in this purified, tranquilized state and turn my awareness in that direction to know what is happening and receive in reflection, the person there cannot know that I am observing him. There is no intervention, there is no real contact at all, and it is entirely safe. Nothing of me projects out. I'm still in my castle, in my protection of the body consciousness. But with this, you can have access to anything, including, and this is the most important part for us, a reflection of the self, of the divine, and of any power or aspect of the divine. Everything is accessible. So the mind, so purified and tranquilized, can in fact turn gently to feel the presence of the self and receive that imprint. Or, and so you see the successive steps they build, or a powerful concentration may discover God in the world. This discovery of God in the world is enormously made easier if already the first step of purified and tranquilized mind is present. But upon that, if we bring a powerful concentration, you may discover God in the world. And this would be in the sense of a perception of the self or the divine presence immanent in things. It will be as if the whole play of the world is on the surface like a form. Behind that, though, we feel this powerful presence. So when, for example, the mind turns in this way, in its purified, tranquilized state, to seek to feel the self, it can reflect within it. We feel the presence of the self within us, reflected in the mind. Or if at that moment the senses are turned outwards, and we seek to feel the presence of the self, we feel it now filled all around. And it is as if the presence settles, fills the space, a powerful peace, a power, a presence, an intensity, or as if a wide conscious awareness. It feels conscious, awake, observing, like a being, a person, but of cosmic proportion, and we simply feel it. So the reference though here, the suggestion is the need for a powerful concentration. Because when we so aim at this kind of an experience in the world, it is necessary for the concentration to disengage from all the things that it is normally attracted to by habit. I'm attracted to the appearance of this form, this movement, this activity, those thoughts, and so on. And I need to turn my attention away from them, put it exclusively on the idea of awareness of the divine presence. Of course, this is made enormously easier with the purified and tranquilized mind. But still, even to gain that, you would need some degree of concentration. So this would be the second experience, discovery of God in the world. And third, the self in nature. So it may discover the self in nature. This experience takes it a further step. While the discovery of God in the world would be like a backdrop supporting, the experience of the self in nature can even be as vivid as experiencing in each thing, in each form, in each object, in each process, in each experience, in each event, the presence of the self playing, enjoying, filling, thriving. And of course, it can be everywhere. It can be in the things immediately before us, whatever specific direction our senses are turned to at that moment. A purified or tranquilized mind may reflect, or a powerful concentration may discover God in the world, the self in nature, even before it is realized in ourselves. So the second experience also is enormously amplified by the purified and tranquilized mind within. So in the first case, we are in a state of relative relaxation as a mirror reflecting whether it is God in the world or it is the self in nature. In the second case, we are concentrating intensely, exclusively on that experience, and it is as if we make a breakthrough and perceive God in the world or self in nature. Or the first and the second methods merge, and there is a much easier, spontaneous experience. But all of these would still be outside, a realization outside. I have not experienced that in myself, and I remain the same. But I become now enormously more humble. I'm changed by that vision in my relationship with the world, but I still remain this humble ego person. In many bhakti traditions, it is this kind of experience which is the starting point to the recognition that through service we attain to God. So you serve others, you serve God in the world, you serve Him as He suffers in the sufferings of people and help to elevate that suffering. And there is always this outward turn of serving in things, in forms, in the world to make the world a better place. And through that I will grow, through that my ego sense will thin, through that I will attain to my right relation as the servitor of God. Certain traditions may stop there and say, that's all you can do. You remain always a servant of God. Or others say, through that, as the ego dissolves, you will attain to your right relation with the divine, lose yourself, merge in, or whatever variation that they seek to attain. But this is rare and difficult, he says, to start first outside. And it is only in ourselves that we can observe and know the process of the self in its becoming and follow the process by which it draws back into self-being. So these things are most easily done internally. But one could take the same, what was described earlier, and apply that inward. So a purified and tranquilized mind, and we turn to the experience of God within us, or the self within, or we have an enormously concentrated, enormously powerful concentration going deep within to realize God within us, or the self supporting from behind. These also are possible internally, but the one thing we can do, which is only in ourselves, is that we can observe and know the process of the self in its becoming. That we observe that everything emerging in us, flowing out, is coming from the self, and it is the self which dynamizes the self to manifest, to become all this that I am, and that flows into the world. This experience can only be had internally first. And you can follow back that process by which it draws back into self-being. So the first thing we notice in this introspection inward, that things emerge from within. Everything emerges from within. Our thoughts, our feelings, our motivations, they all have layers and layers of origination behind. I used to think that I am choosing to do this, but then as I introspect, I discover that there is something else which compelled me to choose in this way. And I go deeper and deeper and deeper. And eventually I discover this power moving out from deep within, which molds the whole imprint of my personality and my life direction. Anything which is not in tune with that somehow seems not so interesting. I cannot hold attention or interest on it long enough. That's not so important somehow. Of course, when I observe it within myself, I begin to notice it in others, and I notice that there's a certain temperament, a turn of nature, but which is chosen by something deep inside. And you begin to distinguish between the deepest sources of motivation and the superficial sources of motivation, which are sometimes heredity, sometimes habitual, sometimes influences from outside. And so when you go back, tracing this thread, you distinguish between these, you recognize what is true from deep within, and you can go backwards deeper and deeper into yourself. You will find this description in Savitri, Sri Aurobindo's poem Savitri, where he describes how Savitri turns inwards to find her soul. And as she goes deeper inside, there comes a point where she finds all these beings and powers rushing out from her soul, rushing to act into the world. And then she has to go deeper still until she finally comes in the presence of the source of them all. So this possibility of tracing back to notice how the self moves into its becoming and follow the process back, that takes place in ourselves. Therefore, the ancient counsel, know thyself, will always stand as the first word that directs us towards the knowledge. You'll find this stated in so many different traditions, in so many different ways. And then he says, still, psychological self-knowledge is only the experience of the modes of the self It is not the realization of the self in its pure being. So when we observe ourselves through this psychological analysis, get to know ourselves, and he said that is a good step in the right direction of knowing the true self, but that is only an experience of the modes of the self. All of these are powers, rhythms, influences, aspects of the self. But the realization of the self in its pure being is behind. And how do we get to that? This is what he describes now. The status of knowledge, then, which yoga envisages, is not merely an intellectual conception or clear discrimination of the truth, nor is it an enlightened psychological experience of the modes of our being. It is a realization in the full sense of the word. And then he defines what the full sense of the word realization is. Before we look at what it is, it's important to know what it is not, so that the pure understanding of what it is freed from the natural distortions that we would have brought in from what we thought it must be, from past habit or from wrong understanding. So it is normal process in any spiritual communication to first remove what it is not, and then to bring what is. And you will find this principle even in the Indian philosophical discourse. It is normal practice in any philosophical explanation to first say what this thing is not, and then to go to what it is, so that as you absorb the experience of what it is, you don't allow the mixture of the wrong understanding to come in the way. So what the status of knowledge is not in the approach of yoga? It is not merely an intellectual conception. We can have the conception of an absolute, conception of a self, of an underlying essential reality. All of these conceptions are just mental creation. Do they actually exist? Maybe, maybe not. We can behave as if they do, but they'll still remain conceptions of the mind. This is generally what happens in most philosophical teaching today. Modern philosophy is all about playing with thoughts and ideas. It is not concerned with whether those ideas are real, whether they actually exist. I had a friend who was somehow attracted to philosophical study. He took up a course in an elite college in Australia, and 6 months down, he had to abandon the course. He said, I was so disappointed. In all the discussions with the teachers, I would of course draw from what I had read of Sri Aurobindo, and I would run rings around them with arguments. But at the end of it, I said, but aren't you interested in understanding what is real? And they said, no, we're just interested in playing with these ideas, and that's all philosophy is about. We don't go beyond that. So he said, for me, it was so dissatisfying that I had to leave the course. But for a certain type of humanity, that itself is a satisfaction. I enjoy playing with these ideas. Oh yes, I know all about the self. I know all about this tradition and that tradition. They say this, they say that, the other one says the other. But what's real? What's important? What is lasting? It doesn't matter. These are the different traditions and their statements. And it is not also clear discrimination of the truth. So I can make a clear discrimination. This is true, that is not true. This idea is more correct, that idea is less correct. And I can so sift all the different teachings of different schools and experiences and come to my own hierarchy of more encompassing, more essential, more inclusive ideas, more correct, less correct, more complete, less complete. But that's not it either. Nor is it an enlightened psychological experience of the modes of our being. So this goes even deeper. This says, I experience the different movements, the energies, the tendencies of my inner being, and I am fully aware of them. Even I have an enlightened experience of them, that is, I know them as they are, truly. happening within me. But even this is not enough. It is a realization in the full sense of the word. Now he describes that. It is the making real to ourselves and in ourselves of the self, the transcendent and universal divine. And it is the subsequent impossibility of viewing the modes of being except in the light of that self, and in the true aspect as its flux of becoming under the psychological and physical conditions of our world existence. So this is the full scope of what is meant by the realization. First, it is the making real to ourselves and in ourselves. The making real to ourselves and in ourselves. So that is, something becomes real to us, and then it becomes real in us. I experienced this extraordinary presence. I felt it outside me. I experienced this extraordinary presence and it sank deep into me. It was me. You see the difference. And this is the making real to us and making real in us. So often in the first approach, we have a glimpse of the self, the divine, the transcendent. And there is still I, the observer, perceiving this, feeling overwhelmed by this perception. But when I allow myself to be overwhelmed, it is as if the ocean breaks my boundaries. I am lost in it. I am one with it. But that transition to allowing yourself to be overwhelmed and still retaining the perception or the record, that takes often time. I shared an experience once by somebody who was a senior director in Naropa University. He was a Buddhist. And he said, when he was relatively young, he had not yet taken to the spiritual life in a formal way. He had a dream experience in which he was climbing a very high wall. And then he reached the top of the wall and he looked out, he looked beyond. And there was this immensity, immense pitch black darkness. And as he looked out, he felt a tremendous fear seize him. And it was such an intense fear that he woke up from it. And somehow that imprint remained all through his life, and today he's quite aged relatively from when it happened. It was his first glimpse, dream experience of that transcendent reality taking place in a part of his own higher consciousness, the memory of which he retained, the imprint of course remained through the whole life, and even I will say molded his life. Although the intellect may not have fully understood what that was. But still it was something outside, and therefore it was overwhelming and it evoked fear within him. So still as a first step, the reality of it was seen to him. That reality eventually would have to be experienced in him of the self. So that would be the second step in it. So of what? Of the self, of the transcendent divine and the universal divine. These are the three broad facets of our recognition of that. So the experience I've described here in his dream experience was the transcendent. So it was pitch black, indescribable, but so overwhelming as if the whole universe could be extinguished in it. And so the ego, fragile ego, feels this tremendous fear. The universal divine would be more easy. It would be the sense of the whole universe being alive, being conscious, filled with the divine presence, power, etc. Or the self, which would be like a backdrop supporting everything subjectively within us or in the universe as a support behind all of it. Any one of these three would be felt real first to us and then in us. And then subsequently something else happens. It changes us fundamentally. Only then is it a realization. And the nature of the change is that now everything is seen in the light of that, as an aspect or a play or an expression of that. And it is now impossible to see it otherwise. As long as it is possible to see it otherwise, it is not yet a realization. When it is impossible to see it in the old way, then we say it has become a realization. So he says, and it is the subsequent impossibility of viewing the modes of being except in the light of that self. There comes a time when, as the consciousness is interiorized, as the psychic influence begins to grow stronger and more permanent, or as there is an opening to a higher consciousness, or a part of the mind is filled with a light, or we rise into a higher mental or illumined or intuitive consciousness, there comes a time when we even forget what it is like to be in the old way of thinking. It becomes difficult to understand why people think the way they do, because we find nothing in us resonating with that kind of seeing, with that kind of thinking, with that kind of prioritizing. It seems even alien. That's a struggle. It's a struggle to even recover that. But it's still possible in certain kind of a special concentration. You see how hard it would have been for the mother to try to come down into the human consciousness and see it from the way it is at, and then deal with it on that level. She would see right through the person and his self-deception, and still she had to put forward a part of herself in this way that is understanding, compassionate to that self-deception, gently nudging it to free itself from the distortion. And so you'll find some very interesting examples of the way it appeared to people. In one case, a person with whom she was discussing in detail plans for the next few days or weeks of work, and the next day the person died. And so somebody asked him, Mother, didn't you know he was going to die the next day? And mother said, there I know, here I don't. I withhold the knowledge. So similarly, Sri Aurobindo was asked, when you make an effort, why is it that you have to make an effort? Don't you already know how it's going to happen? Why can't you just do whatever it is that you have to do with the full knowledge of things? He said, the destiny is not fixed. Although he can see what is in the domain of the current trend of destiny, he said he prefers to withhold from that knowledge so that he can intervene and modify things as necessary. If once the intuition sees something, it becomes much more difficult to modify it, because in your own consciousness now that is a reality. It's the intuitive consciousness is not like the surface mind that sees a picture of various things. What it sees, it knows in identity, and therefore you are one with it. The fact that you are one with it makes it much harder now to intervene to try to change it. So he says he sets aside that kind of seeing where necessary. Of course, he will allow it, but mostly he would set it aside so that he could intervene on a situation, not being bound to the inevitability of that intuitive knowledge. It's a very interesting insight into their way of doing things. So when this realization takes place, you being one with it, there is an impossibility of viewing the modes of being except in the light of that self. Now everything is seen as an expression of that self, because now that is the basic reality in me. And what does it mean? Modes of the self, everything is an aspect, a facet, a movement, a play. And in their true aspect as its flux of becoming under the psychological and physical conditions of our world existence. So when the self moves to manifest its power, In the domain of the physical and psychological layers, this is the way it plays out, and they are all its play. When we look at the difference between the normal functioning of the intellectual mind and that layer that Sri Aurobindo calls the higher mind, this is the key difference. That in the higher mind, you still have thoughts, you still think out, but the thoughts themselves are in relation to the self. All things are seen in relation to the self. Nothing is seen merely as another piece in relation to another piece. All is seen on the backdrop of that. So, for example, if you had to look at a particular situation, let's say we have a situation of strife somewhere in the world. Seen from the higher mind, you would see it in relation to the backdrop of self and its unfolding in human evolution. How would that backdrop of self be seen? It all depends on where we are in terms of the stabilization of the higher mind, but you would see it in terms of a timeless journey. So, across time, in the unfolding history of humanity, oh, this is the place, this is the role that this event has, or this difficulty is seen in this context of the larger movement. And then you see, of course, what good can come out of it, what distortions could further develop in it, and so on. So it could be in the sense of time, or it could be seen in the vastness of space. Everywhere in the universe, all possibilities are playing out. Here, this possibility plays out, while there, that possibility plays out. But this possibility itself is in context of a larger possibility of something good emerging, in which this narrow point of pain is now seen in context of the larger movement of awakening. Or it may be seen in the backdrop of the struggle, the pressure of the self unfolding, and the resistance of ignorance of the narrow petty ego, and how that clash unfolds in this problem. Whatever the specific aspect, it would always be in relation to that reference of the self that you would see things. And even a thought, an ordinary thought, would have that as the backdrop. So it is a realization, that is a status of knowledge which yoga envisages, is realization. In the full sense of the word, it is the making real, that's why realization, the making real to ourselves and in ourselves of the self, the transcendent and universal divine. And it is the subsequent impossibility of viewing the modes of being except in the light of that self and in their true aspect as its flux of becoming under the psychological and physical conditions of our world existence. So everything in the world will be seen as the unfolding and of the flux of the self in its becoming in these regions, acquiring these characteristics, these limitations, and so on. This realization consists of three successive movements: internal vision, complete internal experience, and identity. So this is how we enter into any realization. First, there is a vision of that. But the vision itself is not an ordinary vision, it is the internal vision. Then that vision leads to an experience. It becomes living and intense, and that leads eventually to an identity, and then the realization is complete. So what these three steps are is what he now describes in the next few paragraphs. It is quite elaborate. What this internal vision is quite elaborate, and a whole long paragraph, which we will then take up next time. Maybe we can pause here and take up any questions or comments. So, so it started because Sri Aurobindo asked a disciple when they meditated with the mother. Sri Aurobindo asked the disciple what happened to him in meditation. So Sri Aurobindo asked, now what about your meditation? Disciple, not successful, sir. Sri Aurobindo, how? I saw you going in and powerfully wrestling your way towards the Brahman. Disciple, plenty of thoughts invaded me. I tried to reject them and make myself empty. Sri Aurobindo, the result was emptiness? Disciple, but that is meditation, surely. Another disciple, and then the first disciple, no, it is not. I could not go into nothingness. I did not feel the presence. Was it meditation, sir? Sri Aurobindo, that is the beginning, the first condition. The mind must first be quiet for the other things to come down. But one must not dictate to meditation what it should be or not. One must accept whatever it brings. Disciple, but was it right? Sri Aurobindo, right about what? Disciple, that I was able to reject thoughts? Sri Aurobindo laughing, how do I know? You are to say that. I was only making comments on your statement. Disciple, you don't know? We consider you as omniscient. Sri Aurobindo, you don't expect me to know how many fish the fishermen have caught, how much they have made out of it. People from Bombay used to ask me if the price of cotton would go up, about race horses, and about their lost children. What is the use of knowing all that? You know Ramakrishna's story of the sannyasis crossing the river? He said it was a siddhi worth half an anna. You know the story that this man who spent 10 years intense tapas to develop the power to walk on water. And Ramakrishna laughed at him and said, I pay half an anna to go across. That's the value of your siddhi. So, and then he says, Sri Aurobindo says, of course, if necessary, one can know these things in a way. But I am not occupied with these sorts of things. I have left it to the mother. See, there's an interesting arrangement between them. Sri Aurobindo does not get into these specifics, but mother does because she is handling the action in the material plane and Sri Aurobindo is working on the inner dimension. And he says, I have left it to the mother. She hears what is being said at a distance, meets sadhaks in subtle plane. She said exactly what was going to happen in the recent European trouble. We know what we have got to know for our work. So there is a filter which is placed on what is necessary for the work, and the rest is set aside except as required. Disciple, what puzzles me is that you never told me when asked about the diagnosis of a patient. Sri Aurobindo, what do you expect? Why do you expect us to do your work? This is obviously the doctor. He says, you never told us about this diagnosis. Why do you expect us to do your work? Disciple, oh, that is different. But you said you have no latent medico in you and hence you can't say. I thought you could say by your intuition. Now Sri Aurobindo's answer. Sri Aurobindo, I was telling you, we know what we have got to know, but it is not always good to know. For instance, if I know a thing is going to happen, I am bound to it. And even if it is not what I wanted, I have to accept it. And this prevents my having a greater or another possibility. So I want to keep myself free and deal with various possibilities. Below the supermind, everything is a question of possibilities. So I keep myself free. I can accept or reject as I like. Destiny is not a thing fixed. It is just a complex of forces which can be changed. Disciple, without knowledge of the thing, how shall one work? After knowing what is to happen, cannot one reject it? Sri Aurobindo, knowledge comes by intuition. One can reject, but the result is not sure, though failure may show the way for later success. Okay, so the key is this. Knowledge is a two kinds. There is the superficial knowledge. Someone says, oh, it's going to rain. Oh, I will do something to intervene and change it. But the true knowledge is always the intuition, where you know you have it in the certainty. But in the very act of knowing, the certainty is there. And the power of that certainty is now in you. So you can make an effort, but now you're struggling against what you already have as a certainty. But he said even the failure may pave the way for a later success. So you may still do that. So disciple, you have said in an August conversation you have said in an August conversation that you have conquered death by natural process, but you have no control over accident. Sri Aurobindo, where? What did I say? Disciple, if I remember rightly, you wrote to me that diseases can't end your life, but still you have no control over accidents. Sri Aurobindo, oh, diseases usually run a long course, so one has time to act on them if there is a disease. But if there is a disease suddenly of a severe nature that ends life immediately, then conquest is not possible. You see the difference? Because the intervention needs time, energy, and there's a process. And about accidents, the body has its own consciousness and is always alert. But if the mind is occupied with other things, then an accident can take one unawares. As regards violence, for example, of a riot, I would have to concentrate for 4 or 5 days to protect myself. So see, he is operating in a domain where still there is a balance of forces and certain intensity has to be built up for a certain outcome. The hostile forces have tried many times to prevent the darshan, but I have succeeded in warding off all those attacks. This time I was more occupied with guarding the mother and I forgot about myself. This is just after his accident. I did not think that they would attack me. That was my mistake. As regards the ashram, I have been extremely successful. But while I have tried to work in the world, results have been varied. He gives a list. In Spain, I was splendidly successful. General Miaca was an admirable instrument to work on. Working of the force depends on the instrument. Basque was an utter failure. Negus was a good instrument, but people around him, though good warriors, were too ill organized and ill occupied. So you see, the action is through a person. The person is effective, but the organization was ineffective there. Egypt was not successful. Ireland and Turkey, a tremendous success. In Ireland, I have done exactly what I wanted to do in Bengal. Turks are a silent race. So the rest goes on into other discussions of China, Japan, the Japanese way and all that. So, very interesting comments about the Japanese temperament and how it is being spoiled by other influences and all that. And even about India's independence. Just as an example. What about India's independence, disciple asks? Is it developing along your lines? Sri Aurobindo, surely not. India is now going towards European socialism, which is dangerous for her. While we are trying to evolve true genius of the race along Indian lines and all working for independence. So you see what actually happened afterwards was the Nehruvian socialism and the mess that it created. Then he says, take the Bengal movement. The whole race was awakened within a short time. People who were such cowards and trembled before the sight of a revolver were in a short period so much changed that police officials used to say, insolent Barisal, the people of Bengal. It was the soul of the race that woke up, throwing up very fine personalities. The leaders of the movement were either yogis or disciples of yogis. For example, Manoranjan Guha Thakurte, disciple of B. Goswami. So again, they discuss differences. Disciple, was he a nationalist? Sri Aurobindo, good Lord, he was my fellow worker. He also took part in secret society. Then Brahmo, Bandhava, Upadhyaya, etc. Ramakrishna and Vivekananda's influence worked from behind. You see, with individuals, they had each behind them certain presiding influences of these spiritual beings who were active to help for the work. It is so even today. It has been, I may say this in confidence. I don't know whether this would be. I don't think it will be wrong to say it. The present Prime Minister Narendra Modi is a great admirer of Swami Vivekananda, and it has been the experience of many in the Ramakrishna Mutt and also people here that he is supported by Swami Vivekananda's inspiration and consciousness. And many things which come through, even he may not be conscious of the importance of what is being said or what is being done. But as long as he is in tune, it is discovered after a while how important that was. So it is rare. It is probably the first time since India became free of colonial rule that we have a prime minister who has this kind of a spiritual opening. Then Sri Aurobindo says, the movement for the secret society became so formidable that in any other country with a political past, it would have led to something like the French Revolution. The sympathy was of the whole race was on our side. Even shopkeepers were reading Yugantar, the journal. I will tell you an instance. While a young man was running away after killing a police officer in Sham Bazaar, he forgot to throw away his revolver. It remained in his hand. One shopkeeper cried out, hide your revolver, hide your revolver. Then you have heard of Jatin Mukherjee's exploit. Disciple, yes sir. Sri Aurobindo, a wonderful man. He was a man who would belong to the front rank of humanity. Such beauty and strength together I have not seen, and his stature was like that of a warrior. The remarkable people. This is where this text ends. The part, though, which you asked about is this, that he says it is not always good to know how things are moving because it interferes. And the importance of the time frame required to alter, to modify an event. I remember this question had come up also when this Englishman, poet, what was his name? Something with J. Does anyone remember? In the early years of the ashram, there was an Englishman who was a great poet. And at some point he became very sick. And Sri Aurobindo asked for him to be taken to Bangalore for treatment. And on the way, they kept receiving telegrams from Sri Aurobindo saying, please send immediately the details of his condition. And the person who was with him did not send information in time or whatever it was. And he died on the way or just after reaching. Arjava. Arjava was the name that Sri Aurobindo had given him. So it was an interesting question why Sri Aurobindo needed to ask for this kind of information. And we have many such cases where they would tell somebody that the patient is not receptive, but the person who is in with the patient is a receptive instrument, and the force acts through that person on the patient. So one has to recognize that when you're working in the domain of limitations, even the divine force has to find its way through and around. Of course, the force always has the power to bypass all these and make an exceptional intervention, what we would call a miraculous intervention. But even these are miracles. They are using existing arrangements to create an outcome which was impossible for those arrangements. Yes. All the time. But especially it happens when human beings are not open or are not receptive. That should not happen here. But after all, we are what we are. So. I remember it was to Dr. Dalal that the mother said She said to him, he is the one who has compiled so many books and he has been also an extraordinary doctor. And she said to him, I could have done much more work with you if your vital was strong enough. But the frailty of the system, which could not support an intensity of force, limited how much work she could do through him. But still, in terms of quality of work, it was extraordinary. Intensity and quantum perhaps would be limited. So the biggest difficulty in the current evolutionary transition is the lack of sufficiently conscious, receptive, and developed instruments. If this could be increased, either in quality or in number, it would make things much easier. The thing itself will happen, but the nature of the passage will be determined by these things, the receptivity and the effectivity of those who choose the higher life. In the same text, there is a initial portion where Sri Aurobindo speaks about some of the prophets of the past. It's interesting for the observation. Of course, you must keep in mind always these were recollected from memory. So the accuracy of the words and phrases will be not perfect. Disciple to Sri Aurobindo, were you ever a Freemason, sir? Sri Aurobindo, my eldest brother was. From him I gathered that it was nothing. But Freemasons had something when it was started. Have you heard of Cagliostro? I don't know if this is Cagliostro, but here it's written Cagliostro. He was a mystic and a Freemason with a great prophetic power. He prophesied about the French Revolution, the raising of Bastille, and the guillotining of the king and queen. He used to prophesy about race horses. He got into trouble and was imprisoned and died in prison. He never charged any money from anyone, and yet he was affluent. It was said he knew alchemy and could make gold. There was a few minutes silence. Sri Aurobindo, have you heard about Nostradamus? No? He was a Jew. At that time, Jews had great knowledge. He wrote a book of prophecy in some obscure language and prophesied about the execution of Charles I, the end of the British Empire, and the lasting of the empire for 330 years. Disciple, then there is still a long time. Sri Aurobindo, no. It was to be counted from the beginning of her colonies. That means from James I. In that case, it should end now. But you see, interestingly, how much knowledge Sri Aurobindo had of not only these people, their prophecies, and the precise meaning of those prophecies. Even today, people struggle over the interpretation of some of these prophecies. Sri Aurobindo, the English always kept their policy open so that they may change and correct as they like or want. Disciple, but they cannot join Italy or Germany. Sri Aurobindo, why not? They can share with them France's African colonies. You see the political understanding insights that he had. At that time, mother came. We looked towards her and changed our position. Mother, don't move, don't move. Disciple, we have decided to meditate when you come. Mother made big eyes and we all laughed. Mother, but if I want to hear the talk? Disciple, then we will talk. Sri Aurobindo addressing the mother, I am giving him a few prophecies of Cagliostro and Nostradamus, whom he has never read, he says. Disciple. You know, Bhikshu X was quite illogical. He called me back from here. I called him back from the ashram. Sri Aurobindo. All preachers are illogical. Were you a fervent Buddhist? Is there much Buddhism in your parts? Disciple. About 1 or 2 million people are Buddhists, and there is nothing of Buddhism in what they follow. Mother, nothing or something of Buddhism? Disciple, something. Mother, in China and Japan also, no Buddhism is left. Only ceremonies remain. In Ceylon, they say there are still some authentic Buddhism. Disciple, in Burma also the same is the case. This might be uh, Pavitrada, who was in Burma. There people put on ochre clothes at day and throw them away at night. But the Burmese people show a great respect for their bhikshus. Disciple, yes, respect to dress and not to the reality. Sri Aurobindo's comment, you see. Sri Aurobindo, Lele used to have the same idea. Once I met a sannyasi with him. Lele asked me, you don't bow down to him? I replied, I don't believe in the man. Lele said, but you must respect the yellow robe. The sannyasi was one of 3 people whom Vivekananda drove out of his house. And they became avatars in one day, self-declared avatars. Is he just the man to be so treated? So, then they had a meditation, and Sri Aurobindo commented on the disciple. You seem to have ananda in your meditation. Your face is beaming with it. And then the disciple says shyly, I fell into deep sleep, I think, but I had some visions also which seemed to be quite distinct outside. Sri Aurobindo, then why do you call it sleep? It may be the psychic being or the inner being watching what is happening. Sometimes one goes into deeper state and remembers nothing in his outer consciousness, though many things may be going on within. What is called dreamless sleep is really a sleep in which dreams are passing on. Only one does not know. Sometimes one discusses problems in such a condition, gets the ecstasy of union, etc. One may also go into other parts, one may also go into other worlds with one part of his being and meet other forms, etc. This is, of course, the first condition and a kind of beginning of samadhi. From what you describe, it may be an inner being's experience and not psychic. Even then, no doubt that your face is beaming with ananda, seeing which I thought you went within. So that was the. So he would see immediately what the condition of the person was. If he wanted, he could go very deep inside. There's another description of how, in the early days, a disciple had come to meet Sri Aurobindo. And then Sri Aurobindo said to him the next day, yesterday the mother saw you. And he says, yes, of course, she was sitting there, she saw me. He said, no, she saw you. And then he began to describe layer by layer all that was happening inside the person. And he was quite shocked. I remember this from one of the interviews, perhaps. I don't remember. But the mother kept that power of perception and action in the minute details fully open, again, as necessary for the work. While Sri Aurobindo was concentrating on the other side of the inner action. So next time we turn to this internal vision, the inner drishti, which follows after the introspection and inner observation that we have done. The internal vision awakens, and from there the internal experience leading to identity and the realization. Om. Om.